I've read with certain sadness that statues of Pushkin and other famous Russian writers are being destroyed all over the Ukraine. Pushkin, as you may know, is one of the most famous Russian poets, and he died in a duel at only 27 years of age. There are also many streets in the Ukraine named after Pushkin, but they want to rename them. One of the proposals was to rename them for American horror writer Stephen King. There was a street in Kiev named after Leo Tolstoy, and it was renamed Ukrainian Heroes Street.
Многие говорят, а почему Пушкина трогаете? Зачем переименовывать одну из центральных улиц Харькова Пушкинскую? Такое милое для слуха харьковчан название. Очень-очень классная улица, приятная, связанная у многих с очень хорошими воспоминаниями. Да дело в том, что это одна из центральных улиц. А мне кажется, что Пушкин, который действительно, естественно, не бомбит, не обстреливает ни Харьков, ни другие украинские города, он на том самом знамени русского мира, под которым происходит так называемое освобождение нас от так называемых нацистов, он, к сожалению, одна из составляющих скреп вот этого самого русского мира. Его так или иначе используют. Поэтому мне кажется, что Пушкинская улица не должно быть в Харькове. Я знаю, что это мнение разделяют не все харьковчане.
There are many writers who were born into what's now the Ukraine, but they all wrote in Russian and considered themselves Russian. Nikolai Gogol was Ukrainian when Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire. Taras Bulba, which I read, is about Ukrainian Cossacks fighting against the Poles. But they talk about Russia as their motherland. Of course, the Ukrainian nationalists don't like him either. They say he was a sellout for the Russian Empire. Then there is Mikhail Bulgakov, who wrote The Master and Margarita. He was born in Kiev, but he lived mostly in Moscow. Guess what? The Ukrainians consider him Ukrainophobic, because he lived in Russia and was not in favor of the Ukrainian independence. Anna Akhmatova was born in Odessa, which is today still part of Ukraine, for now. But she moved out and lived most of her life in St. Petersburg. She had a hard time during Stalin, her son was imprisoned, and her poem Requiem, which is about that period, was published only many years after her death. But she wrote in Russian and she's considered Russian. She lived for some years in Kiev, but she didn't like it. I've had a tough life in Kiev and disliked both that land and its language, she wrote. Of course, Ukrainian nationalists hate her too. But is there any famous Ukrainian writer who wrote or writes in Ukrainian? Maybe there is, but I really don't know any. So maybe they should rename their streets after Stephen King. Now, I guess I can understand them removing the Soviet movements because they were part of a specific regime. And I'm personally not a fan of communism, but communism was not just a Russian thing. It spread all over Asia and Eastern Europe, and of course there were many Ukrainians who were communists too. So to see it as just some form of Russian imperialism doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. I don't know. But now it turns out that they are not just against communism, they don't like the Russian Empire either. But the problem then is that there's no much left. Then they have to start the history of the country from 1991, basically. And I'm more or less in favor of nationalism in general. I think all people should have self-determination if possible. For instance, I think that Catalonia should be able to separate from Spain if that's what they want. But this is more or less as if Catalonia separated from Spain and then they said, okay, we don't want anything related to Spain, and so they destroyed all the statues representing people from Spain and all art by Spanish artists, and then they renamed all streets so that no street was named for a Spanish writer or artist. And then they removed all the books of Catalonian writers who wrote in Spanish instead of in Catalonian. And then they said, no one is going to speak Spanish here anymore. And then imagine that there is a group of Spanish people that had remained in Catalonia and they said, we want to keep speaking Spanish and we want to keep our Spanish culture. And then the Catalonians said, no, you can't do that. And then the Spanish said that they wanted their own independence, and then the Catalonians started bombing them. It sounds crazy, but that's more or less what Ukrainians seem to be doing. A complete and total rejection of their past, which, for good or bad, is shared with Russia. It's part of their history, and they are exchanging it for a present that is much, much poorer. Maybe I'm wrong, but there seems to be something weird or pathological about this kind of nationalism. I like nationalism, as I said, but I think healthy nationalism should be based on love, not on hate. Perhaps Nazi Germany also failed because it was more based on hate of Jews and Slavs and Untermenschen than on love of their own people. I don't know, maybe not. But Ukrainian nationalism seems to be based mostly on hating Russia and not wanting to be Russian. And that doesn't seem to be enough.